What happened to women when the smoke of a Viking raid cleared and the line between survival, captivity, and forced marriage blurred in a world ruled by power and necessity? Raids were among the most defining features of the Viking Age, but their consequences extended far beyond stolen silver and burned villages. For the people caught in their path, raids shattered families and reordered lives, especially for women. While popular imagination often focuses on warriors and ships, the quieter aftermath reveals a darker reality in which captives were taken, distributed, traded, or absorbed into Viking households. Forced marriages and captive brides were not romantic aberrations, but part of a brutal system shaped by demographics, labor needs, and social structure. The Viking world suffered from a persistent imbalance between men and women. High male mortality from warfare, dangerous voyages, and harsh living conditions created instability, yet in some regions, the opposite problem existed: a shortage of women within expanding settlements. This imbalance was intensified by practices such as female infanticide, hinted at in some sources, and by the outward expansion of Viking communities into new lands. Raids, therefore, served not only as economic ventures but also as a means of acquiring people, particularly women, who could be integrated into households as laborers, concubines, or wives. Captivity began in violence. Women taken during raids were stripped of legal protection the moment their communities fell. Their previous identities as daughters, wives, or free women were erased, replaced by a new status defined by ownership. Some were enslaved outright, forced into hard labor or sexual exploitation. Others, particularly those deemed valuable due to age, appearance, or skills, faced a different fate: incorporation into Viking society through coerced relationships that could evolve into long-term unions. Forced marriage in this context did not resemble the negotiated contracts of free Norse women. There were no dowries brought by the bride's family, no guardian advocating her interests, no legal safeguards discussed at assemblies. Instead, the power dynamic was absolute. The captor decided her fate, whether as a concubine, secondary partner, or eventually a wife whose status might increase over time. The transition from captive to wife was not immediate nor guaranteed, and it often depended on the woman's ability to adapt, survive, and bear children. Children played a crucial role in transforming captivity into permanence. A woman who bore a child to her captor entered a more complex social position. While she might still be legally unfree, motherhood tied her fate to the household. In some cases, children born from such unions were acknowledged, particularly if the father lacked legitimate heirs. This acknowledgement could elevate the mother's status, gradually shifting her from enslaved captive to something closer to a recognized partner. Yet this elevation was fragile, dependent entirely on the man's standing and the tolerance of his kin. The sagas and later chronicles hint at these realities through fragmented narratives. Captive women appear as silent figures or as outsiders who struggle to assert themselves in unfamiliar cultures. Their voices are rarely recorded, but their presence is unmistakable. They are the mothers of sons who later claim inheritance, the foreign wives whose origins spark tension, the women blamed for bringing misfortune because they are seen as reminders of violence. These stories reflect an unease within Viking society about forced unions, even as they remained embedded in practice. Forced marriages also served political purposes. High-status captives from noble families could be used to legitimize claims over conquered territories. Marrying a local woman, even under coercion, could symbolically bind land and people to a new ruler. In these cases, the captive bride became a living treaty, her body and lineage used to stabilize occupation, yet her lack of consent lingered as an unspoken truth, revealing the limits of such strategies. Religion offered little immediate refuge. Pre-Christian Norse belief systems did not provide moral condemnation of captivity as understood today. Strength, success, and survival were valued, and raids were sanctioned by cultural norms that celebrated conquest. Gods associated with victory and fertility were invoked to bless households that included captive women, reinforcing the idea that these unions were acceptable outcomes of warfare. The suffering of the captive was secondary to the prosperity of the household and the continuation of lineage. Yet acceptance did not erase tension. Captive brides occupied a precarious space within Viking communities. They were insiders and outsiders at once, responsible for domestic labor and child-rearing, yet marked by their foreign origins and lack of kin support. Unlike free wives, They had no powerful relatives to defend them, no inheritance to reclaim, no assembly to appeal to. Their security rested entirely on their usefulness and the protection of the man who claimed them. Over time, some captives assimilated, learning the language, customs, and rituals of their new world. Cultural adaptation could soften their outsider status, particularly if they demonstrated loyalty or competence. Still, assimilation was survival, not choice. The memory of violence lingered, shaping relationships within the household and influencing how children understood their own identities. Sons of captive women might face suspicion, while daughters inherited the vulnerability of their mothers, reinforcing cycles of inequality. The existence of forced marriages exposes a fundamental contradiction within Viking society. On one hand, marriage among free people was governed by law, negotiation, and mutual obligation. On the other, captivity erased those principles entirely. This contradiction was not accidental. It was a reflection of a society that valued order within its own boundaries while exploiting chaos beyond them. The same culture that protected the rights of Norse women could simultaneously deny humanity to foreign women taken by force. As Viking expansion intensified, these practices became more widespread, embedding themselves deeper into the fabric of Norse settlements across Europe. Forced unions were no longer isolated outcomes of individual raids, but part of a broader system of population growth and control. This system left lasting scars, not only on the captives themselves, but on the societies that absorbed them, shaping identities, loyalties, and unspoken histories that continued to unfold as captivity turned into uneasy belonging. And the boundaries between slave, wife, and survivor grew increasingly blurred as the story moves forward. Life for captive women did not end when the ships reached shore and the violence of the raid faded into memory. In many ways, that was when a different struggle began, one fought quietly within longhouses, farms, and newly claimed settlements. These women entered Viking society stripped of legal identity, language, and kinship, yet expected to function immediately within households that depended on strict roles and relentless labor. Their survival depended on adaptability, silence, and endurance in a system that offered little protection and even less recognition. Most captive women began their lives in Norse households as enslaved laborers. They worked in fields, tended animals, prepared food, and performed the exhausting domestic tasks that sustained daily life. Enslavement was not temporary by default. Many captives remained unfree for years, their bodies treated as resources rather than individuals. Sexual access was assumed, not negotiated, and refusal was rarely possible. In this context, the line between enslavement and forced marriage was not clear but gradual, shaped by circumstance rather than consent. The transition from captive to partner often began with usefulness. A woman who demonstrated skill in weaving, food preservation, or household management could become indispensable. Textile production alone was critical to Viking economies, and a skilled weaver was an asset worth protecting. This usefulness could lead to marginally better treatment, lighter labor, or more stable living conditions. However, improved status did not equal freedom. It merely altered the form of dependence. Pregnancy changed everything. Bearing a child to a Norse man anchored a captive woman permanently to the household. Motherhood created obligations that extended beyond her own survival. While she herself might remain legally unfree, her child's status became a subject of negotiation. If the father acknowledged the child, particularly a son, that acknowledgement could grant the child limited rights and, by extension, elevate the mother's position. This elevation was precarious and could be revoked, yet it marked a shift from disposable labor to tolerated presence. In some cases, captives were formally freed and married, especially when demographic pressures demanded it. Isolated settlements, newly colonized lands, and regions with limited access to Norse women relied heavily on captive brides to stabilize population growth. These marriages were rarely equal. The woman entered without dowry, kin support, or legal leverage. Her security depended entirely on her husband's protection and reputation. If he died or rejected her, she could easily fall back into vulnerability, lacking the safeguards afforded to freeborn wives. Within households, captive women existed in constant comparison to free wives. Free women held keys, managed resources, and commanded respect as lawful partners. Captive women, even when elevated, often remained subordinate, performing much of the labor while receiving fewer privileges. Tension between free wives and captive women was inevitable. Jealousy, resentment, and fear of displacement shaped these relationships, particularly when children were involved. A free wife's legitimacy rested on law and lineage, while a captive woman's presence was a reminder of violence and instability. These tensions extended to children as well. Sons born to captive women could be both valued and distrusted. If acknowledged, they strengthened a household's workforce and future security. If not, they remained marginal, their fate tied closely to their mother's status. Daughters inherited even greater vulnerability. Without strong kin networks, they were at risk of exploitation, forced unions, or resale, perpetuating cycles of captivity across generations. Cultural isolation intensified these struggles. Captive women brought with them languages, beliefs, and customs that were often suppressed or ridiculed. Conversion to Norse ways was expected, not negotiated. Religious rituals, naming practices, and seasonal traditions reinforced their outsider status until assimilation erased visible difference. Even then, memory lingered. A woman's origin could follow her for life, whispered in disputes or invoked to explain misfortune, marking her as perpetually other. Violence remained an ever-present threat. Without legal standing, captive women had no formal recourse against abuse. While extreme cruelty could provoke social disapproval, especially if it disrupted household productivity, punishment depended on community tolerance rather than law. A woman's safety relied on her usefulness and the willingness of her owner or husband to shield her. This reliance created a form of coerced loyalty, where survival demanded emotional and behavioral conformity. Despite these constraints, captive women were not entirely powerless. Influence could be exercised quietly through child-rearing household. Routines and relationships formed over time. Mothers shaped the values and identities of their children, transmitting fragments of their own culture in private moments. Advice offered to husbands, information shared within households, and emotional bonds formed with children could subtly affect decisions and outcomes. This influence was informal, invisible, and fragile, yet real. As Viking settlements expanded across Ireland, Britain, and parts of continental Europe, the scale of captive integration increased. Entire communities emerged where a significant portion of the population descended from forced unions. Over generations, origins blurred, and the distinction between captive and freeborn faded in appearance, if not in memory. Yet the foundation of these communities rested on coercion, leaving unspoken legacies that shaped social hierarchies and identity long after the original raids were forgotten. The psychological toll of forced marriage and captivity is largely absent from historical records, yet it cannot be ignored. Trauma, grief, and dislocation were carried silently, expressed only through behavior interpreted by others as obedience or acceptance. Survival required emotional containment, and over time, endurance could be mistaken for consent. This misinterpretation allowed Viking society to normalize practices that depended on sustained human suffering. By absorbing captive women into households and lineages, Viking society expanded its reach and stabilized new territories, but at a cost that remained largely invisible. The system succeeded because it transformed violence into routine, turning conquest into domestic order. As generations passed, the original act of force receded into family history, replaced by narratives of settlement and growth. Yet beneath these narratives lay unresolved tensions that would surface as laws, beliefs, and moral frameworks began to change, pushing Viking society to confront the contradictions at the heart of its practices as the story continues forward. Over time, the dynamics of forced marriages and captive brides evolved as Viking society matured and spread, shaped by changing demographics, social pressures, and the gradual adoption of new religious and legal frameworks. While the earliest raids had relied on sheer violence and opportunistic seizure, later practices reflected more deliberate strategies for incorporating captives into households and communities. Women taken during raids remained vulnerable, yet some found paths, limited though they were, towards survival, adaptation, and even influence within their new environments. As settlements became permanent and Viking influence extended across the British Isles, Ireland, Normandy, and beyond, the role of captive women shifted from temporary laborers to essential participants in community building. In remote colonies or newly conquered territories, Norsemen faced a shortage of free women to marry, leading to increased reliance on captive brides to stabilize households. These Women often became de facto wives, assuming responsibilities comparable to freeborn women, managing farms, raising children, preparing food, producing textiles, and teaching cultural norms. Their labor, once coerced, became indispensable, making them central to the survival and growth of these new communities. The children of these unions, particularly sons, were pivotal in transforming forced relationships into enduring households. By bearing children, captive women tied themselves permanently to the Norse lineage of their captors. Sons could inherit property, serve in military campaigns, and carry on the family name, granting their mothers a level of security otherwise impossible for a woman without kin support. Daughters, while more vulnerable, could be married strategically to create alliances or reinforce household labor. In this way, reproduction became not only a means of survival, but also a route to influence and partial recognition within the household, legal and religious. Developments further reshaped the position of captive brides. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, it introduced moral and legal expectations around marriage, monogamy, and legitimacy. The Church condemned concubinage and highlighted the spiritual and social importance of legitimate unions. For captives already integrated into Norse households, this shift complicated their status. Some were formally married to their captors under Christian rites, elevating them from unfree concubines to recognized wives. Others remained in ambiguous positions, bound by social custom rather than law, illustrating the friction between traditional practices and emerging religious norms. Assimilation into Viking culture required more than legal recognition. It demanded the adoption of language, ritual, and daily practice. Captive women were expected to learn Norse customs, participate in seasonal festivals, and adopt domestic routines central to household identity. Over time, cultural barriers diminished, yet the memory of violence and displacement remained. These women often carried dual identities, as survivors of conquest and as functional members of their new society. Their ability to navigate this duality determined not only personal survival, but also the integration of their children and the stability of the household. Social hierarchies within Viking settlements reflected both origin and utility. Captive women, even when assimilated, occupied a liminal space. They were insiders by virtue of labor and motherhood, but remained marked by their foreign birth and the circumstances of their arrival. Status depended heavily on the man's recognition, the children they bore, and their capacity to maintain household order. While freeborn wives retained legal privileges and greater autonomy, captives exercised influence subtly through domestic management, child-rearing, and advisory roles. These informal channels of power, though invisible in official records, were significant in shaping family dynamics and local social networks. Conflict and tension persisted. Rivalries between freeborn wives and former captives were common, particularly over the status of children and allocation of resources. Household disputes could escalate into wider family tensions, as kin networks became involved in defending or challenging claims. Similarly, children born to captive women navigated uncertain social terrain. Sons might be recognized, partially legitimized, or sidelined depending on paternal acknowledgement, while daughters could face vulnerability in securing advantageous marriages. These dynamics reinforced the complex interplay between power, gender, and survival, underscoring the enduring consequences of violence and coercion even decades after a raid. Despite systemic vulnerability, captives sometimes carved out authority through skill, loyalty, and maternal influence. Women who demonstrated competence in household management or child-rearing could achieve a measure of security and respect. Mothers transmitted cultural knowledge, traditions, and practical skills, subtly shaping the identity of the next generation. Their influence extended beyond the domestic sphere. Advice, insight, and personal relationships within the household could affect decisions related to land, labor, and alliances. In this sense, even coerced entrants into Viking society could assert agency, albeit constrained by circumstances and social hierarchy. Over generations, the integration of captive women left lasting demographic and cultural impacts. In regions such as the Danelaw, Normandy, and Ireland, a significant portion of the population descended from women initially taken during raids. These lineages blended Norse and local customs, producing hybrid communities that carried forward the influence of both origins. The legacy of forced marriage was thus embedded into the very fabric of Viking settlement, shaping family structures, inheritance patterns, and social norms. While the trauma of initial coercion faded from immediate memory, it persisted invisibly through cultural adaptation and social organization. By the late Viking Age, these practices began to recede in prominence. The consolidation of Christian norms, increasing literacy, and the development of codified law offered more protection to women and emphasized consent and legitimacy. Raids still occurred, but the large-scale abduction of women became less socially sanctioned. Forced marriages persisted in isolated cases. Yet the broader system that had once normalized captivity as a means of securing households diminished. Former captives, now integrated, occupied defined social positions, their children recognized as heirs and community members. The shift marked both an end to the most extreme forms of coercion and a transformation in the understanding of marriage, gender, and power within Norse society. The story of captive women in Viking raids reveals a society simultaneously structured and chaotic, legalistic yet opportunistic, capable of creating order from conquest while leaving deep human costs in its wake. Forced marriage was not an anomaly, but an integral tool for survival, expansion, and household continuity. Women endured displacement, labor, and coercion, yet their resilience shaped families, influenced settlement patterns, and transmitted culture across generations. Their experiences illuminate the often overlooked human dimension of Viking expansion, showing how conquest, survival, and adaptation intertwined to define lives, communities, and legacies that endured long after the last longship sailed into history. Ultimately, the legacy of forced marriages and captive brides extends beyond the immediate impact of raids. It highlights the intersection of violence, gender, and social structure, revealing how power operates in both public and private spheres. Through endurance, adaptation, and maternal influence, captive women transformed circumstances imposed by force into contributions that shaped the development of Viking society. Their stories are embedded in the foundations of Norse settlements across Europe, a testament to human resilience amid conquest, and a reminder that the consequences of violence extend far beyond the battlefield, echoing through families, communities, and generations yet to come.